group idea is very important in both classical and quantum physics, and in fact more in the quantum case than in the classical case, one can say. The idea of a group is algebraic in spirit, but when we talk about the representations of a group, it connects up with the theory of linear vector spaces, operators on vector spaces, differential equations, eigenfunctions, and so on. I can only give a very limited treatment today and tomorrow. So let me start by giving the definition of a group. A group is a mathematical object. If we use the letter capital G for it in general, it consists of a set of elements, and I will write various elements in various ways, and on this set certain mathematical operations are defined. The main thing is something called the composition law, or it is sometimes also called the multiplication law. The composition is a better word. So, the structure of a group is given by a few rules. If you take any two elements in the group, then they determine in a unique way something called the product or result of composing them. That should also belong to the group, to the same set. This composition law must obey the associative condition. If you take any three elements in the group in a definite sequence, then if you compose B and C first and then take the result and compose it in A, you must get the same element as you would get if you did it in a different order. So there is no need to use brackets at all. You can just write ABC as a product for any three elements. The third condition is that there must be a unique element in the group which is conventionally written as small e. It is called the identity element. It must satisfy this condition. Composition of any element with e will always give back the element e. And the fourth is the existence of inverse. Take any element in the group, there must exist another element in the group called the inverse of A, such that composing A with A inverse gives you the identity element. For those of you who have copies of these lecture notes, this is equation number 116 on page 23. Now, there are qualitatively several possibilities that can be imagined. You might have a group in which you have a finite number of elements, maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe 24, and so on. In that case, the number of elements in the group is called the order of the group. You may have a situation where you have an infinite number of elements. In that case, again you can imagine two qualitatively different situations. One is where you have a discrete number, infinite discrete number of elements. Then you will say it's a discrete group, but its order is infinite. A third possibility you can imagine He said you have a group with infinitely many elements, but they are a continuous infinity. And so then you would call it a continuous group. In the tutorial classes today, I would like you to try and solve all the cases of problem number 3.1, and also as we go along you will see the tools to attack problem number 3.3. I will not be there, most probably I will not be there in the tutorials today, so I want to request whoever runs them to try and make sure that 3.1 is looked at in full detail. Every case mentioned should be studied and the question should be answered. Now let me give you a few examples of groups. The first example is a very famous family of groups in classical mathematics, group theory. These are called the permutation. So S subscript n is the group of permutations on n objects. That is, you imagine you have n distinct objects and you might as well use the numbers 1 to n to label them like names, and then the elements of this group consist of the operation of rewriting this sequence in any other sequence. Rewrite it in such a way that 1 will appear somewhere, 2 will appear somewhere, and so on. So the operation of rearranging the starting sequence 1, 2, 3 up to n in all possible ways gives you a group. Can you guess what is the order of this group? In how many ways can you rewrite the sequence 1 to n in other ways? For example, 2, 1, 3 up to n, 2, 3, 4, 1, 5 up to n, and so on. N factorial. The order is n factorial. If you take, well, what is the identity element in this group? It is the operation of not changing anything, leaving the sequence as it is. That's the identity element, what I call E in general. If you take two different permutations, there is a natural way to combine them or compose them. You apply the first permutation, it will rewrite this sequence in a new way, and then you apply the next permutation operation, then you will get some final sequence. And that will be the product of the first two. So these are very famous and they have been studied for a very long time. Now I will just mention names only, I might describe them later on. From the physics point of view, there is a very important group called the group of rotations in the Euclidean plane. That is, you take an origin in two-dimensional plane and you can imagine drawing an x and a y axis, and you can imagine rotating the axis continuously by any angle. So these operations of rotations in a plane about an origin, they form a group. Because you make one rotation and another rotation, the result is a third rotation. No rotation at all, identity. Combination of two rotations, as I said, add the rotation, and rotation. Inverse of a rotation, go back in the opposite direction, and so on. So we will describe this later on. So this is a group of rotations in the plane, proper rotations. And how many elements are there in this group? Well, a rotation can be by any angle theta, which can go all the way from 0 to 2 pi radians. So it's a continuous family. So there are infinitely many elements in this group. The letter S, as I had mentioned in some context yesterday or day before, tells you this corresponds to proper rotation. Rotations which start from no rotation and build up everything continuously. No reflections. A related group, which is also important physically, is the group of all rotations in a plane, proper as well as improper. Improper meaning you allow changing the sign of the variable. You allow reflections, mirror reflections. Then, when you come to three-dimensional Euclidean space, you have the group of proper rotations in three dimensions. And I would imagine that when you study rigid body dynamics in classical mechanics, you may be using the structural ideas of the group of rotations. Here again, S means you have proper rotations only. That is, you may start from a right-handed coordinate system, apply a rotation, the result should remain a right-handed coordinate system. They form this group SO3. This is also a group with infinitely many elements, and you can, we will see later today or tomorrow, what the elements of this group look like, what is the identity element, what are inverses, how do you compose elements, and so on. And lastly, I will mention group of rotations in three dimensions which include improper operations. That means reflection in a plane or reflection through the origin and so on. That is called the full orthogonal group in three dimensions. It consists of proper rotations plus all improper ones as well. Just in this list, because today's and tomorrow's lecture are going to be rather sketchy, at least a few notions I should introduce to you. This is an important group called the Euclidean group. And I am hoping to tell you more about it later, but now I will just say it is the group of geometrical operations in three-dimensional space which preserve all the theorems of Euclidean geometry. It consists of the following operations: three-dimensional rotations plus three-dimensional translations, shifting the origin of a coordinate system. So there are two kinds of elements in the Euclidean group: operations which preserve the directions of your XYZ coordinate axis but shift the origin by any amount. Then there are other elements where you keep the origin fixed but you change the directions of X, Y, and Z. And then the most general element of the Euclidean group will be a combination of both. Some rotation plus some translation. In special relativity, we have to deal with the Lorentz group. Today I will just give it as a name. At the moment I just mention it as a name. Later I hope to show you a little bit more about the Lorentz group. And all the physical consequences of special relativity are ultimately contained in the properties of the Lorentz group. There are other higher dimensional generalizations of these things which are important in many fields of physics, and I might just mention one or two. One can imagine rotations in any number of real Euclidean dimensions. One can imagine something like SO3, something like three-dimensional rotations, but generalized to 4 dimensions, 5 dimensions, any number. So there is a whole family of groups which are called the orthogonal groups in various numbers of dimensions. Now all of these groups and all that I have used up to here basically have been built up using real numbers. But there are other groups called the unitary groups. These are to be thought of as, I have introduced this concept of a complex linear vector space, and I have described the concept of an inner product and a complex vector space. What does that involve? As I said earlier, two generalizations are involved, starting with Euclidean three-dimensional space. One is to go from real numbers to complex numbers. The other is to increase the dimension, make it anything. So, if you have a complex n-dimensional space, it's a nice, beautiful generalization of physical Euclidean three-dimensional space. You have increased the dimension to n, and you have replaced real numbers by all complex numbers. The geometrical properties in that case, and if you have an inner product, that is called unitary geometry. And the transformations which preserve all the geometrical results in n-dimensional vector spaces given a scalar product, they are called the unitary groups. And there are notations for them. I don't know if I will be able to come to this, but at least if you have seen these symbols, then next time when you come across it somewhere, it will not be unfamiliar. You will be prepared for it. In high energy physics, elementary particle physics, these groups are all very, very important. Even in atomic physics, nuclear physics, they are important. Okay. Now, here is a general definition of a group, and what I have called the composition law has the following feature. When you give me two elements in the group, first A and second B, and when I say use the group composition law to discover their product, I must tell you in what sequence I have to compose them. In general, the result of composing with A on the left and B on the right may be different from B on the left and A on the right. It means that given two elements of the group, there is no such thing as a unique product. You have to decide in which sequence you want to compose them. So now, if a group is such that whatever pair of elements you choose, the result of combining them does not depend on the order, then it's a very simple case. Such a group is said to be abelian.
Abelian.
Huh? Abelian. Where does this name come from? Abelian. Huh? Who was it and when did that person live? What do you know about him or her? Niels Henrik Abel was a Norwegian mathematician who lived in the early part of the 19th century. He died very young, in his 30s. From India's point of view, a few years ago, since there is no Nobel Prize in mathematics, the Norwegian, the Bank of Norway or some institution in Norway has established a prize called the Abel Prize in mathematics. And it is regarded as the mathematics equivalent of the Nobel Prize in Science. And one of the people who won the Abel Prize is Professor S.R.S. Varadan from India, who is settled and works in the Courant Institute in New York. And when we have lunch every day in that corridor there, you see his portrait on the notice board. Isn't that right? It is some lecture
At the breakfast thing.
It is a breakfast.
Opposite the statistic.
Yeah, breakfast. Opposite, yeah. Notice board of the statistics department. So he is originally Indian. He got the Abel Prize a few years ago. Now, if on the other hand, in a group, there are at least some pairs of elements for which the product AB is not equal to the product BA, such a group is called non-abelian. In the abelian case, very often, instead of writing the composition law in this way, we often write it as A plus B. So that's a different notation for the same idea. We usually think of the group operation as a kind of multiplication, but in the abelian case, it may often be more natural to think of it as an addition. You might now convince yourself that a vector space, real or complex, is an abelian group. The operation or the composition law is addition of vectors. What vector plays the role of the identity element? The 0. And what is the inverse of any given vector with respect to addition? It's a negative. So you can combine what you learned about vector spaces with these ideas now. Alright. Now there is a very large series of concepts which are important, but I just don't have the time to develop all of them. What I am trying to give you is a kind of aerial survey, like a Google map of all these ideas. One or two at least I will mention. In any group, there is an operation called the operation of conjugation. What does it mean? Conjugation says if you give any two elements A and B, then you consider the product BAB inverse. Now this is B is in the group, A is in the group, B inverse is also in the group. Then this product is also an element of the group. Let me call it A prime. So this will be in the group for any A and B in the group. This operation of producing A prime from A is called the conjugation operation. We say you conjugate the element A by the element B and you get a new element A prime. This particular operation has a special name. And then one says A and A prime, this is a technical word, they are said to be equivalent elements in the group. This is one example of an important group theoretical idea which I want you to at least hear about, and you might some other time study it in more detail. Again, those of you who have my lecture notes, things are given in full detail here. I hope you will look at them sometime. The next concept which is important, and I just say it in words, is the idea of a subgroup. For a vector space, you remember how we introduced the idea of a subspace. We said if you have a vector space V and you have a subset of V, say V1, we will call it a subspace if by itself it has all the properties of the vector space. That is, multiples of vectors in V1 must be in V1, sums must be in V1, etc. In the same spirit, if you have a group G and you pick some subset, a few of the elements of G, call them capital H, they will form a subgroup if products of elements in capital H are also in capital H. Inverses of elements in capital H are also in capital H. The identity is also in capital H, which means that H by itself has all the properties of the group. So naturally, one would call it a subgroup. Then, with the idea of a subgroup, other related ideas, I just don't have the time, but I name them cosets, invariant subgroup, and so on. So these are things which one will have to learn if you are seriously interested in group theory. Now a few concepts, operations involving more than one group. Suppose you have two groups, G1 and G2. And let us suppose that you write the elements of G1 as A1, A2 and so on. Is that from the MSc students? And let us write the elements of G2 as B1, B2 and so on. The identity in the group G1 will be written as E1. The identity element in G2 will be written as E2. Alright. So now there is a simple procedure by means of which we can construct a new group, the direct product of these two groups, and it is naturally this notation is a very, very simple idea. What you would say? It consists of ordered pairs. That means a pair of things. The first element in the pair is any element taken from G1. The second is any element taken from G2. And to these pairs we can give a group structure. What you say is that if you take one pair, A1, B1, and another pair, A2, B2, we will define the result of composing them to be A1, A2, B1, B2, another ordered pair. So what you are doing is telling the elements of G1 to mind their own business and the elements of G2 to mind their own business. So the result is another ordered pair. So this is a nice looking composition law. What do you think should be the identity element in this product? What should A2 and B2 be so that start with A1, B1, you end up with A1, B1. B1, A2, B1. The ordered pair of the individual identity elements. And what should be the pair representing the inverse of the pair? Now that you know what the identity is, very good. A inverse, B inverse. Of course, in that sequence, the element of G1 written first and the element of G2 written next. So this is actually a very trivial construction. You can construct the product G2 cross G1. Convince yourself there is really nothing new that you will do. What you get as G2 cross G1 will be essentially the same. Now what do we mean by essentially the same? That leads us to two other very useful concepts involving two groups at a time. The concept of the isomorphism of two groups. Two groups are said to be isomorphic if you can establish a one-to-one relationship from G1 to G2. So how shall I write it? You take any A in G1, then the image should be phi of A, you may call it B, and it should be in G2. And now this must have the following property. This should be 1 to 1 which means what? Distinct elements in G1 must go to distinct elements in G2. It must be onto. What does that mean? Every element of G2 must be the image of something in G1. Lastly, and it must have an inverse. Phi inverse must be there. And lastly, the product of two images must be equal to the image of the product. So, take any two elements A and A prime in G1. A is mapped into phi of A. A prime is into phi of A prime. Now you can do two things. First, use the mapping phi and then compose as elements of G2. Or you can first compose in G1 and then go to G2. If the results are the same, then you say you have established an isomorphism from G1 to G2. What this means is that, forgetting everything else, regarding the elements of G1 just as a group and those of G2 as a group and no other properties, these two groups are really the same. There is no way to distinguish them. So, this is the concept of the isomorphism. In this statement, of course, G1 and G2 are any groups. Of course, the number of elements in G1 must be the number same as in G2. The orders must be the same if they are finite. If there has to be an isomorphism. Now, please don't confuse. Please don't confuse G1 and G2 in this definition. It is the general choice of G1 and G2 to form a direct. If you want, I can write G3, G4 if it is confusing. You want me to change that notation? It's not, it's alright. So now, I said earlier, given two groups, you can form the direct product in this sequence or in the sequence G2 plus G1. Now it's a trivial thing. You can convince yourself whether you form the product G1, G2 or G2, G1, those two ways of constructing a new group give you isomorphic groups. Anything in G1 cross G2 can be mapped uniquely into a corresponding element in G2 cross G1 and all the conditions for an isomorphism will be obeyed. Yes? So I may write here, in this case, understood that this mapping is 1 to 1 onto inverted. So, when shall we say that two groups are essentially the same? We shall say they are the same if it is possible to set up this one-to-one correspondence which will take each element of G1 into its unique image in G2. You must get the whole of G2 by this process and you must be able to come back from G2 to G1. Each G2 element must be the image of some unique G1 element and then the multiplication in G1 and in G2 must be compatible. Image of products must be product of image. Alright, so this is the concept of isomorphism. The other important thing I want to do, there are 2-3 more concepts, but I will talk of homomorphism, then I will go on to other things. What is the concept of homomorphism? Now you can see that in the case of an isomorphism, the roles of G1 and G2 are really symmetrical. Why? Because if you have a mapping phi taking you from G1 to G2 and you are demanding that it should have an inverse and be 1 to 1 and on to, you have a map phi inverse bringing you from G2 to G1. So you can just say the groups G1 and G2 are isomorphic to each other if there is such a phi. Then, as far as group theory is concerned, we don't have to distinguish between them. Now, the concept of a homomorphism is more subtle, and it is a relationship between two groups which is not symmetrical in the two groups. Now, we say for the group G1 to be homomorphic to G2 or whatever the wording is, you need a mapping phi from one group to the other such that products of images must be image of the product, nothing more. You do not demand that this should be one-to-one. You do not demand that it should be onto. You do not require an inverse. So this is a weaker relationship, and now one can say the group G2 is a homomorphic image of G1. And in this statement, the two groups do not have symmetrical roles. That must be clear. Typically, many elements in G1 may have a common image in G2. So typically, in a homomorphic relationship, the group G1 will be larger than G2. Okay, that's the basic idea. So, as I said, there are other general ideas involving groups and operations with them, but I will not go into them. There's just one thing I will mention here, just the name, no digits. We talked of a direct product structure. Just the idea of ordered pairs of group elements with each group minding its own business. Now, there is a more structured concept called a semi-direct product. I mention it only because it is important in physical situations. It is a way to combine a group G1 with a group G2 in a way different from the direct group. It also consists of ordered pairs, an element A1 from G1, comma, element B1 from G2. But the rule for composing them is not so simple. It is more involved. I don't have the time or the machinery to describe it, but at least I want you to know there is some way to combine two groups in a different way from direct product. It is called the construction of a semi-direct product. To construct such a product, some other operations, some other properties have to be satisfied. When everything is provided, then you can construct this. It is different from direct product. Right. So next, so this much for the groups. As I said, I will be describing some of the rotation and other groups a little more in detail later, so you will see examples, quite a few examples as we go along. Now I will start talking about what are called representations of groups. This is where what we have studied about vector spaces, linear operators, etc. all come into play. Any question from anybody? Can try to clarify at this point general theory, general ideas. So,
Sir,
yeah.
what is the difference between a field and a group?
Field, I have forgotten. There are various things. Field, ring. You know what is the difference between field and A field ID is a vector space.
It's a commutative group for plus as well as dot.
So it is a mathematical set where it is a vector space. So with respect to vector addition, it is a abelian group. And then it has a algebraic dot. That is, you can multiply elements as well.
So the elements of fields will be either real or complex or both.
I think most general field is very many types are there. I think in number theory, in quantum computation, quantum information, people use fields of various kinds based on prime numbers, modulo prime numbers, so on. It's a very highly developed field. Since I think in most of my own work, research in physics, particle physics, certainly, the concept of a field by itself has not played any important role, except that a group enormous amount of importance. Field, we have lived senior citizenship without clearly understanding what is a field. And we have been fairly successful. This is no excuse for not knowing what it is. I will just skip it. I'm not very familiar because I've never had to use it. But one time, I guarantee 50 years ago, I knew the precise definition of the field. I even knew at that time definition of a ring. But since we never used it for these 50 years, just forgot it. Okay. So now, suppose a group G is given, and we want to set up the idea of a representation of this object. What you then need is a linear vector space V, which may be real or it may be complex. Now, in partial continuation of that answer, the only fields which we generally use are a set of real numbers or set of complex numbers. That is all that is needed for most physical situations. But nowadays, I'm warning you, in the subject of quantum computation, many number theoretic features are becoming important. So there people talk about different kinds of fields. Alright. So, what do we have to provide to arrive at this concept of a group representation? To have the group, you must start with some linear vector space. It may be real or it may be complex. And then what should you have? For each element in the group, we must have a linear operator D, typically written as D of G, which acts on. Now we have seen what we mean by linear operator on a vector space. You take a vector in V, you apply the operator, the result is another vector. And the action is such that the operator acting on a sum of vectors or a linear combination of vectors is a linear combination of the action, the sum of the actions. So we have studied quite a bit what we mean by linear operators. So for each group element you must have a corresponding linear operator. Now these operators must have the same composition properties, the same algebraic properties as the group itself. And then you say you have a representation of the group. So what are those laws which these linear operators must obey? If you take two group elements, the corresponding linear operators on V, when you multiply them, linear operators you know can be multiplied, they must be the same as the operator representing the product element. The unit element or the identity element must be, we say, represented as or realized as unit transformation on V. What does this mean? Take any vector x in V, This thing when it acts on x gives back x. Nothing happens. What is the third property which we should ask for? Can you dictate that? What shall I write? D of equal to well, I will help you. I will just add one word here. In a group representation, each group element must be represented by a linear operator on V which has an inverse. So what shall I write here? The inverse of V. This is the third. So these are the conditions for you to get a representation of the group. Now, here is an interesting question. When you go back to the properties defining a group, what were the statements we had here? I think 4, not 3 statements. A statement like this was there, that was the first one. That any two elements can be composed to give a result. Then what was the next statement? Associative. What is the next, third statement? That is here. What's the fourth statement? Here. Why is it that I don't write any requirement here corresponding to associative? Why is that? The idea is very simple. Suppose you have a vector space and you have a linear operator A and a B and a C and a D and so on. Multiplication of linear transformation is very simple. Take a vector, apply the first transformation, get a result, then apply the next one, get a result. That gives you in an automatic way a rule to multiply linear transformation. That rule, please convince yourself, is automatically associated. Okay. So, there is a story behind this, but that is the reason why associativity does not have to be written separately or required separately when defining a group representation. Because representation is bilinear transformation. They always have the associative law. Historically, in the 19th century, people started with transformations in their mind and tried to pull out the essence of their composition properties. Then it was realized that if you want to define a group in the abstract, it is better to make the associative property one of the defining conditions of the group. So the idea came from the fact that transformations are already associative, but if you want to, what is it called? Anyway, extract the essence of the idea, associativity has to be made one of the properties of the group. When you go back to representation, it need not be stated explicitly. So, this is what we mean by the representation of the group. So, please appreciate what are all the things needed. Once a group is given, for each representation of the group, we need a vector space. It will be real or it may be complex. For every group element, we need a linear transformation of the vector space which is invertible, that is, it has an inverse. And these transformations, D of G, must obey the group composition law, the condition for the unity, and this condition for inversion. Then you say you have a representation of the group G. So, the D of G are the transformations representing group elements in this representation. This vector space will have a certain dimension. Now that dimension, a priori, has nothing to do with the number of elements in the group. Suppose this was a finite group. Suppose this was the permutation group, Sn. It has n factorial elements. That has nothing to do with the dimensionality of any representation. They are independent things. In any case, the dimension of the vector space is called the dimension of this representation. Alright? So you may have a group with 4 elements. It might have a 10-dimensional representation. It might have a 15-dimensional representation. Everything is possible. In physical situations, in many cases, we deal with finite dimensional representations. But there are other situations in quantum physics, for example, where we have to deal with infinite dimensional representations. So both are important. When I say that many cases we deal with finite dimensional representations, the group itself may be infinite. For example, this may be the group of all rotations in 3 dimensions. So it has infinitely many distinct group elements, infinitely many different rotations. But you might find there are any number of finite dimensional representations. That is, as I will say sometime later, for the group of 3-dimensional rotations, what are called Euclidean rotations, there is a representation in 1 dimension. There is a representation in 3 dimensions. The 3 dimensions you won't immediately know. That is what vectors belong to. There is a representation in 5 dimensions, 7 dimensions, in every order. Okay? So I want you to appreciate the dimension of the representation is a distinct thing from the number of elements in the group. Now, I want to give you the concept of equivalence of representation. It's an important idea, it's quite a simple idea. After all, we talked a little while ago about the concept of an isomorphism between 2 groups. That was an idea to help us decide when are 2 groups essentially the same, when are they really different. If there is an isomorphism, then we don't distinguish between the groups. In the same spirit, for a given group, supposing you have 2 representations. So G is the same, you have a representation on a vector space V via linear operators D of G. And for the same group, let us suppose you have another representation on some other vector space. So then we say, I will assume that both G and B prime are real vector spaces, or both of them are complex vector spaces. Alright? So, first definitely. So, when shall we say that these 2 representations are really the same? Concept of isomorphism, but at the level of group representation. We say they are equivalent representations if we can construct a linear mapping S which takes vectors in one vector space, 2 vectors in the other vector space with the following properties such that 2 conditions, S must have an inverse. This S inverse exists and it maps you back from B prime to B. So it should be something which can go both ways in a unique fashion. Every vector in B will be taken by S into some vector in B prime, and that vector in B prime will come back to where you started if you apply S inverse. Second, the primed representation must be, let me first write the symbols and then put the inverses where they belong. What do I do now? I think I put the inverse here. No, this is not right. I knew that I would make a mistake. The linear transformations in the second representation must be the result of what you might call a similarity transformation. Where does D prime act? It acts on vectors of D prime. So this equation says to get the effect of the second representation on some vector in D prime, you start with that vector, go back to D. Let the first representation act on that vector. Take the result, then go back to D. So if the two representations on vector space V and D prime are related in this way, we say they are the same representation. We need not distinguish between them. So you can say this is a property or an idea which is very similar to the concept of a isomorphism between things. Just 1 minute. The next concept again brings back something we studied when we talked about linear vector spaces. This is the following. Yeah, is there something I can clarify? Clear? If there is something which is not clear, please ask. It gives me also some rest.
Shouldn't it be S inverse?
Huh?
Shouldn't it be S inverse?
Where? See, remember I told you I put the inverse later and then I put it in the wrong place. See, where does this act on? It acts on B prime. Huh? Now, the way I have defined S and S inverse, S is a matter of B to B prime. S inverse B prime. So that is. Now I come to the concept of the matrices of a group representation. This is a repeat of the idea of representing a linear operator by a matrix. As you so much emphasized yesterday, this does not require a scalar product concept. So suppose we have a group and the representation on the vector space D. Very often we write capital D with a dot rather than a group element, meaning you can put here any one of the elements of G, capital G, and then you get a corresponding linear transformation. Then you say, let this be a basis for U. So the number of elements in the basis will be equal to the dimension of U. So J goes from 1, 2, 3 up to whatever is the dimension. Then remember how we set up a matrix to represent any linear transformation in a basis. We do the same thing here. What we do is the following. We take the transformation representing the group element G in this representation. We allow it to act on each of our basis vectors. First E1, then E2, and E3, and so on. Now for each J, this is the result of the element G in the group acting on that basis vector. Of course, the result is some vector in B. It's a linear transformation. Therefore, this result must be expressible as a linear combination of these basis vectors. So, we write it, we introduce a notation for that. There is a reason for expressing the linear combination in a particular notation. We have a superscript K which is summed over because it is repeated, and in this equation J is a free index. So this means that I can put it this way: each group element, once you have chosen a basis, is represented by a matrix, numerical matrix. If the representation is on a real vector space, this will definitely be a real matrix. But if this were a complex vector space, what can you say? Does it have to be a complex matrix? May or may not. It may be complex, it may also be real. Then you will find that these matrices obey all the properties of the group itself. Namely, and I will just write it once more, when I put this bracket around B, it means that I am talking about a matrix representing D of G in the given basis. So this will be true. The matrices of the representation respect the laws of group multiplication. Product of two of the matrices is the matrix for the product group element. Second, and the matrices of the representation in a given basis. Now, what happens if I keep the representation the same but change the basis? What will happen? I have shown you,
Matrix will
pardon?
matrix
Will change. But how will it change? You remember the equations I have described for a change of basis. Remember I used an S. So if you combine this with that discussion, you will find that a change of basis results in the matrices undergoing similarity transformation. So you will say it is the same representation as before, but looked at in a new basis. So that is why the idea of equivalence will carry over. So the effect of changing the basis is to give the same representation in an equivalent form. Okay. Now one or two. So I hope I am going not at Shatabdi speed, but not at Janata speed either. I hope you are able to get the spirit of things. A few more general ideas in this same family of ideas, and then I may stop. Now, suppose you have a group and you have two representations of this group. Let us say D superscript 1 on a vector space V1, do D superscript 2 on another vector space V2. Suppose you have constructed two representations. Again, I assume for simplicity that both V1 and V2 are real vector spaces, or both of them are complex vector spaces. Now, I think we have studied earlier how to take two vector spaces and define a new vector space, the direct sum. It is there somewhere in the notes. Correct? Now, what now happens is the following. You can take the representation V1, active on V1, the representation V2, active on V2, you can combine them. You can form a new representation of G on which vector space? On V1 plus V2. And it will be a third representation. It will be called the direct sum of V1 and V2. Let us just see how we go about it. What is the form of a general vector in V1 direct sum V2? It is an expression of the form x1 plus y1 what is typically vector lost in notation. Each vector x in the total vector space V1 direct sum V2 is the result of formally taking a vector in V1 and formally adding it to a vector in V2. This way of writing x as x1 plus y1 is unique. That is, the component of x in V1 is unique, the component of x in V2 is unique. It is not that you can write x in this form in two different ways. Then we do a very simple job. We will define the direct sum in this way, and we even write it as a direct sum. What do we have to do to define this representation? We have to say how it acts on a general vector in this direct sum vector space. So all I have to do is to say what is the action of this new representation on a general vector in a direct sum vector space. It's trivial what we should do. We should say let the D1 act on x1, let the D2 act on y1. So this is our definition. So this defines for us the concept of the direct sum of two representations. Alright. There is another concept called direct product of two representations, but I think I will not go into it. Just as we have direct product of groups, which we have defined earlier today, there is a concept of taking two representations of a given group and constructing out of them a new representation by a kind of multiplication. This is an addition, but there is one more procedure. But I just mention it, I will not go into the details. So probably the last concept for today is a concept of an irreducible representation. This is of course very, very important, so I will develop it. So, the first thing to appreciate is the concept of an invariant subspace. This is also an idea which we have used in some of the problems and so on earlier. So, we say let B the representation of the group G on a vector space. Now, I want to define the concept of a subspace of B which is invariant under group action. It's a very natural idea. So I put it on this board. Let G1 be a subspace. Right? Means contains only some of the vectors of the full vector space, but it includes all multiples and combinations of its own vectors. Then we say if for every group element and every vector in the subspace, the action by the group element on such a vector x a result which is also in the same subspace V1, then we say the subspace V1 is invariant under group action. Or we can say this representation of the group contains inside it, you can say, something small. The representation is small. That's a qualitative idea. So then we say, if this happens, and of course we will assume V1 is a non-trivial subspace. That is, it should not be 0. 0 is always possible. We will avoid that. It should not be the whole of V. Then also there is no content. So it is the non-trivial part of V such that it goes into itself under all group elements. Then we say, then representation V of G on the original is said to be reducible. Because you have found a part of the full vector space carrying a representation of its own, typically of a smaller dimension than the original representation. The converse statement is the following. Now I write it here. If there is no subspace V1 invariant under the given representation, then we say this representation is irreducible. It's a very, very important concept. So the basic idea is that in the case of a reducible representation, that there are some ifs and buts and so on, you can imagine that the representation is a result of putting together smaller representation one after the other, like a direct sum. Not precisely, but roughly in that spirit. If it is irreducible, it means that the representation, in a sense, is as small as it could be. In a sense, it means that it cannot be broken down into, in a significant way, into smaller pieces, which are themselves represented. So, this is a very key concept in representation theory. Let me just see what I have kept for tomorrow, and then I will know when to start. Okay. So, I will now mention some facts. Do you have any questions about this? I know I'm covering many, many concepts. Time is limited. The notes are there. Pleasure. Now some descriptions of facts. You have some question? Huh? Something? Like your pendulum, now the energy is going from me to you. I will stop and you should start moving. Professor Mani and I saw some beautiful gadgets made by Mr. Chakradev. They are very, very impressive. So, here are some facts. To derive all of them takes some amount of work, but sometimes it is very important to know some key facts so that you get some guidance if you want to go further in the field, and as you learn more and more, you find out the proofs of those facts. But it is not a good policy to say, I will not look at something until I can prove it. It's a one has to be pragmatic person. So it's useful to know certain facts. Suppose you have a finite group. For a finite group, now I have defined two things. The equivalence of two representations I have defined. That is related by similarity transform. Typically you think of it in the matrix level, it is SDSA. So then I have defined irreducible representation. So I combine the two ideas. You take one irreducible representation, you take another irreducible representation, and you ask, are they equivalent or not equivalent? If they are equivalent, you disregard any difference. You say, I think of them as the same irreducible representation. So what is important is to pick up the irreducible representations and separate them into classes, you can say, which are not equivalent to one another. Because each one has some special features of its own.
Sir, one question.
Yeah.
V is infinite dimensional. V is infinite dimensional.
If V is infinite, yeah.
And subspace, invariant subspaces are finite dimensionals.
Yeah.
Then we can reduce D to finite dimensionals.
Yeah, but then there will be infinitely many dimensions still left, and there will be representations acting there also. So D will contain a finite dimensional piece, but it will have other things also. You are taking the case where this is infinite dimension and this is finite dimension. So, if what you say is true, what I would say is this infinite dimensional representation contains somewhere inside it a finite dimensional part. But that is not the whole of D. The D will act on all vectors in D outside D1 also. That's infinitely many dimensions.
In case of reducible,
Yeah.
in case of reducible representation,
Yeah.
can we separately write D as a finite dimensional representation in that case?
No, if the original D is infinite dimensional, what happened? Somebody is upset with the question. No, if this is an infinite dimensional space, D is by definition an infinite dimensional representation. You cannot get rid of that. You cannot convert it into a finite dimensional representation. I want it to be clear. It may contain a finite dimensional representation sitting somewhere inside. But as a whole, this would certainly be infinite dimensional. Okay, so here are some very important facts. For finite groups, there exists finite number of irreducible representations apart from equivalence. Maybe I should write up to. As I said, if two representations are related by a similarity transformation, we will not distinguish between them. We will say they are the same. So for a finite group, the number of really different irreducible representations is a finite number. Each is of finite dimension. Irreducible representations are all each one of finite dimension. Each is unitary. I am listing many known facts about representations of finite groups. As I say, it is useful to know these things in advance of your knowing the proofs of these things. And lastly, any representation is a direct sum of irreducible. What does this mean? It means for a finite group, the main mathematical problem for representation theory is to construct once and for all the irreducible representations. And it is a finite problem in the sense that there is a finite number of them. And they are distinct, they are not equivalent to one another. And there are theorems which tell you for a given group how many irreducible representations there will be. There are theorems which tell you the dimensions of the representation also. And here I say each of the irreducible representations is finite dimension. So it becomes easier and easier as you go along. This property is a very useful thing. Representations of finite groups with no loss of generality, you can assume they are unitary. What does it mean? They can be represented on complex linear vector spaces, and there will be a scalar product, and the transformations representing group elements will be unitary transformations. This is very important in quantum mechanics, for example. And lastly, any representation of a finite group, even if it is infinite dimensional, it can be built up using the finite dimensional building blocks, which are each one is irreducible. So,
That was I was asking. Can we just have n-dimensional finite representation and build up in
yeah, so now I can say this represents, suppose this G is a finite group. The representation I am talking of here could very well be infinite dimensional. There is nothing to stop you from constructing an infinite dimensional representation of a finite group. Nothing to stop you. But what we can say once you appreciate these theorems is the following. Any infinite representation is the result of taking many finite dimensional ones and stringing them together in the sense of direct sum. But of course it means how many irreducible representations do you need? You need infinitely many. Because each one is finite dimensional, but the total dimension is infinite. In the example you raised. So we can only say if G is finite, even an infinite dimensional representation can be built up from small building blocks. So as far as physics and mathematics is concerned, physics in particular, the basic building blocks for representation theory of finite groups are the irreducible representations. There are only so many of them. They are all, each one is finite in dimension, each one is unitary. Once you have them, in principle, you have all the integers. I think I will stop because I have to go for another meeting now. I will pick up at this point. So, what friend, you said that Ambernath to somewhere it takes what, 2 hours? Is it like a train which stops at all stations or goes super fast? Slowly at all stations. So I have had to go a little fast. I could not stop at all stations on the way. Tomorrow it will start.